Well, hello again. Today's topic is Scholasticism, medieval philosophy, and the reading for that is the selections from Anselm and Aquinas. But before we get into that, I want to talk a little bit about the environment where this is going on. It's called Scholasticism because for the first time in the Middle Ages, philosophy is being done in universities. In fact, the beginnings of modern universities trace back to the Middle Ages. And so I want to talk a little bit first about the medieval universities and how they were structured. Because if some of you go on to grad school, as a few of you should, you'll find something much closer to a medieval university than you do at the undergraduate level. For one thing, in the Middle Ages, some universities were actually run by the students. They hired faculty to teach the courses that they thought they needed to have. You may like that model. Others were run by the faculty. I like that because I think we have a better sense of what you need to know than you might. Nowadays, alas, we've all been outdone, and universities are run by administrators. And I'm not convinced they always have the best interests of faculty or students in mind. The curriculum, and here it might be helpful if you can open up in another tab the late medieval viz document on the optional student aids tab in the module for the Middle Ages. The curriculum was divided into the 7 liberal arts: the trivium, grammar, logic, rhetoric, public speaking, and the quadrivium: arithmetic, geometry, astronomy, and music. Those were the basics that everybody studied, kind of the gen ed requirements. Beyond that, you had only 3 majors to choose from: medicine, theology, and law. But some of you wouldn't have been able to get into a medieval university. No, not because you're African American. Medieval universities grew out of cathedral schools, and so their earliest function was to train priests. And one of the requirements to be a priest in the Catholic Church is you have to be male. It's not the only requirement. It's not even the most important requirement, but it is one of the requirements. So, ladies, you would be out. Now, in a medieval university, when you went to class, you would go to lecture classes for 3, 4, 5 years, working with what we would call a faculty advisor to choose the courses you needed to take. First of all, you would not have any books. Books in the Middle Ages were phenomenally expensive because, remember, they had to be copied out by hand. There's no printing. And so you would take very thorough notes, because those notes are going to be your professional library. Remember, there's no public libraries in the Middle Ages. And so this is going to be reference material that you're going to use for your entire career. So you better pay attention. You would also not take any exams in individual courses, and you would not receive grades. Your exams came at the end, and they were oral. You would meet with a group of professors and answer questions about what you were supposed to have learned during your years at the university. And you had to answer them to their satisfaction. If you go on to grad school, you'll find something like that. In the doctoral program in humanities at Florida State, the doctoral exams were a series, back in 1990 when I took them, were a series of 5 exams, essays, 4 hours each. and they basically lock you in a room with a pen and paper. Now, I asked for permission to use an electronic typewriter because if you've seen my handwriting, well, my doctor says I write like a doctor. I would not have been able to use a laptop because that has memory. The answers have to come strictly out of your head. No books, no notes, nothing. Going into each one, and I had 2 weeks to complete the whole batch of 5. Basically, I took them every other day. There was an exam covering basically a philosophy of education. There was an exam in contemporary religious thought. There was one in religious ethics. That was my major focus. Does that show in the way I teach this class? One on modern humanities, and the one closest to this course, the Western culture course, but in a way also closer to Intro to Philosophy. Well, it covered humanities core courses. There were 3 questions. I was asked to choose one of them. One was the meaning of tragic or comic through the classical, the medieval, Renaissance, the modern period. One was the ancient idea of fate, medieval doctrine of providence. Is there a modern equivalent? The one I chose was war has been a persistent theme in the literature and art of Western civilization. You're asked to choose at least 3 works, making sure that you select one from the classical, medieval, Renaissance, and modern periods, and show how their treatment of war relates to the worldview of the era and society in which they were produced. Well, that's the one I chose. And I set out and started writing. Talked about Homer's Iliad, wrote a good introductory paragraph, like any good essay. Talked about the concept of war in Homer's Iliad and the heroic code. I also, from the ancient world, talked about warfare in the Hebrew Bible. For the medieval Renaissance period, I chose Machiavelli's The Prince. Those of you in Western culture, you're going to be reading a selection of that just a little bit later in the course. But to set that up, I talked about Augustine and the development of the just war concept. In Western culture, we also talked about that. And for the modern period, I chose a painting, Picasso's Guernica, based on an incident of terror bombing in the Spanish Civil War, where the German Air Force supporting Franco's nationalists bombed a town a Basque town in northern Spain that foreshadowed the horrible bombings inflicted by both sides in the Second World War. My answer runs 7 pages, typed double-spaced. But then you're not done. You have to meet with a group of professors to discuss your answers. They ask you questions about what you wrote, and if they think you left something out, you have to answer those questions. So that you have to defend your essays. Once you've been through that process, then you can propose officially the topic for your master's thesis or your doctoral dissertation. It has to add something to the body of scholarly literature on your topic, which basically means your proposal has to show how what you're doing is different from what anybody else has done. And this is my dissertation. It's an application of the ethical theory of an American Protestant theologian, H. Richard Niebuhr, to the issue of homosexuality. And like most doctoral dissertations at Florida State in the humanities, it runs right at 300 pages. But you're still not done. You have to defend this to that same committee of scholars, and they have to quite literally sign off on it before you get to say you are a doctor. Okay. Now, I'm going to be sending you to some other videos dealing with the proofs of God. But I want to go ahead and talk about the end of Aquinas' article, where he talks about the different kinds of law and the relationship between faith and reason. And then I try to illustrate that by getting into Aquinas' views about sex a little bit. See, the game in medieval philosophy was to reconcile the biblical tradition based on revelation and faith with the Greek and Roman tradition based on reason. And one of the essential components of that game was to try to prove the existence of God, relying solely on reason, no relying on the authority of the Bible or of the church or on faith. And the videos that I'm going to send you to for that will talk a little bit more about that. But the idea was that by showing that faith in God is rational, reasonable, by proving God exists using reason alone, then faith becomes something that's not irrational. And in fact, Aquinas is going to argue that there is no contradiction between faith or revelation and reason. And he does that using the concepts of law. And again, here it's helpful to look at that late medieval viz in the student aids tab on this module. Aquinas outlines 4 kinds of law. Eternal law, first of all. Eternal law is God's will, God's plan for the universe as it exists in the mind of God. Well, how can we know what's in the mind of God? Well, really basically the same ways that we can know what is on someone else's mind. The first and most straightforward way is that they could tell us. Divine law for Aquinas is that part of the eternal law that God has revealed to us through the Bible and the teachings of the church. So divine law is part of the eternal law. Therefore, they cannot contradict. Now, might there be some things that God has chosen not to tell us? Well, yeah. Do you tell other people everything that you think? I hope not. But is there another way? Aquinas' answer is yes. Think about observing other people. In a normal school year, as I'm recording this, we're approaching spring break. And, in the week before spring break, often I would see people at the bus station with their suitcase in hand. Well, if you're in my class and I see you, say, on Wednesday afternoon at the bus station with your suitcase ready, I might conclude that I'm not going to see you in class on Friday, the Friday before spring break. You didn't tell me that, but I deduced it from your actions. Likewise, if we believe, as Aquinas does, that God created the world with this plan in his mind, and if we believe, as Aquinas does, that God is a reasonably competent workman, then if we look at the world that God made using reason, we can get some idea of God's intent, God's plan, God's will for the world. Natural law is that part of the eternal law that we can discern using our reason by observing nature. And so it too is a part of the eternal law. In fact, there might be some places where divine law and natural law overlap. And so that's what's behind Aquinas when he says there is a twofold mode of truth in what we profess about God. Some truths about God exceed all the ability of human reason. We could never figure these things out on our own. We could only know them if God revealed them to us. Such is the truth that God is triune, the Christian doctrine of the Trinity, one God in three persons. But he says there are some truths which the natural reason also is able to reach. Such are that God exists, that he is one, and the like. In fact, such truths about God have been proved demonstratively by the philosophers, guided by the light of natural reason. But the key point is this: because what we know about God's will based on reason and what we know about God's will based on revelation are ultimately coming from the same source, the mind of God. They cannot contradict. Although the truth of the Christian faith surpasses the capacity of reason, nevertheless, that truth that the human reason is naturally endowed to know cannot be opposed to the truth of the Christian faith. Okay. Faith and reason cannot, in Aquinas' view, contradict. If we think they do, then we have misunderstood something somewhere. Aquinas would not understand the modern view that science and religion are opposed to each other. For Aquinas, that's not possible, because all truth ultimately comes from God, whether we discover it through revelation or through reason. Now, to illustrate how this idea that revelation can confirm reason and add to it but not contradict, I gave you a little bit of Aquinas' argument about whether woman should have been made in the first production of things. And the way that Aquinas writes, he always sets up a debate. He proposes a question, and by the way, the Summa Theologica, his most famous book, occupies about 2 shelves in a library. And he addresses every question you can think of and some you can't. The question I gave you is whether woman should have been made in the first production of things. And he starts off in this case by giving a series of objections, reasons why it would seem the answer would be no. And he draws from philosophy. When he says the philosopher, that means Aristotle. Aquinas is heavily indebted to Aristotle. He also draws from the Bible, from early church fathers, and it's all equally. But then he says, on the contrary, and he gives you reasons why, in this case, the answer would seem to be yes. And he always does it this way. He always sets up a debate. Sometimes he starts with the no, sometimes he starts with the yes. But either way, he gives you reasons on both sides. And then he says, I answer that. It was necessary for woman to be made as a helper to man, but as a helper in one specific thing. For many things, he says, another man would be a better helper. You know, if I have a piece of heavy furniture to move in our house, who is more help to me in moving that? Our 30-year-old son or my wife? But there's one thing in which another man can be no help at all to a man, and that is in the work of what Aquinas calls generation, reproduction. This is why in Catholic moral teaching, homosexuality is considered against natural law. The natural telos, the natural goal, purpose of sex is procreation. There is nothing that 2 men or 2 women can do that has any chance of producing a baby. This is also why the Catholic Church opposes the use of contraceptives, because they are interfering, they are blocking the natural telos of sex, which is procreation. In Catholic moral teaching, every sex act has to be at least open to the possibility of procreation. Now, it's okay in Catholic teaching that my wife and I, both in our 60s, it's highly unlikely we're going to have children at this point. That's okay as long as we're not doing anything to stop it. By the way, we're not Catholic. My glasses, on the other hand, are perfectly okay in Catholic moral theology because they are cooperating with my eyes to help my eyes perform their natural telos, which is to see. But now, how does this illustrate the relationship between faith and reason? Well, when Aquinas considers the process of reproduction, at what point is that process complete? Is it when a child is conceived? Well, if a child is conceived but then you miscarry, have you successfully reproduced? The answer seems to be no. Is it when the baby is born? What if the baby doesn't survive? Have you really succeeded in reproducing? In Aquinas' view, reproduction is not complete until the young are grown and able to thrive completely on their own when they're grown up. And when Aquinas looks at the natural world, he thinks he sees two kinds of animals. Some animals have a fairly short childhood. They don't have much that they have to learn to be successful at being the kind of animal that they are. And they don't need a lot of care. Think, for example, of the African wildebeest. They're fully grown at a year old, able to have young of their own. And they don't have much they have to learn. I mean, how smart do you have to be to catch and eat grass? And they don't need much care. They can run within a few minutes of being born. And so with animals like this, Aquinas thinks male and female come together solely for mating, and then the female is able to provide the limited care that the young need. Now, why is it the female wildebeest who provides the care? Well, daddy can't make milk. And that's what the young wildebeest needs most of all. Other animals, though, have a much longer childhood. They have a lot more that they have to learn to be successful at being the kind of animal that they are. And they need a lot more care and for this longer extended period of time. Think, for example, of the African lion. Okay. It takes lions several years before they're considered mature. They need to be cared for a long time because they have a lot they have to learn. See, they eat, among other things, wildebeest. And unlike the grass that wildebeest eat, wildebeest do run away. And so the lion has to learn how to stalk and get close and how to kill its prey by that bite to the throat that they use. Chasing is instinctive. If you have ever had a pet dog or cat, you know that they'll chase anything pretty much that moves. But what to do with it when you catch it has to be learned. And finally, they need the care and protection of both parents. If the pride males are killed or defeated in a fight and new males take over the pride, the first thing they do is to kill the cubs so as to bring the lionesses into heat so that they can have cubs for the new lions. Without that protection of their fathers, lion cubs have a very short life expectancy. Now, which kind of animal do you think Aquinas is going to say that people are more like? Well, we have among the longest childhoods in all of the animal kingdom. And so Aquinas thinks that therefore reason alone ought to tell you that for human beings the natural context for sex is a long-term relationship between male and female where they're going to stay together long enough to raise and protect the children together. In other words, something like marriage. Now, what does Revelation say? Well, the church teaching has always been that sex belongs in marriage. So you see how in Aquinas' view, Revelation confirms reason. And it also adds to it. In Aquinas' view, Revelation tells you something that reason alone could never tell you, and that is that there is an even higher lifestyle available. That is the lifestyle of celibacy. The ideal of devotion in Catholic Christianity is the monk, the nun, the priest who devotes themselves fully to the service of God through prayer and meditation. And there's no way you can do that if you're married and raising kids. Those of you who have children know what I'm talking about. So in Aquinas' view, Revelation confirms reason and adds to it, but does not contradict. Now take a look at the other videos dealing with the proofs of God offered by Anselm and then by Aquinas.